Thank you so much, Matt, and thank you everyone for coming here today. I'm not entirely sure how 10 or 15 years of my life, so long I can hardly remember how long, came to be entwined with that of Robin Boyd's. As a high school student in 1975, I travelled from my far-flung suburb to stay a few days at Menzies College, and it was a revelation to me. I'm not saying this visit inspired me to be an architect, I mean, what could, or even prompted an interest in Boyd, but it was a revelation nonetheless. I remember feeling cocooned in a spatial labyrinth with its cool and textured tones of brute concrete, unlike the insulated triple front brick veneer with its feral atmosphere that I lived in. For a few days living in Menzies, I felt I was a monastic novice living in a building that affirmed me both as an individual and gave me a sense that I was part of a collective. And the stay was momentarily cathartic when I returned to normal life in the outer suburbs. I didn't really think much about Boyd until I then, many years later, embarked on my thesis on utopian marine and underwater cities of the 1960s, a relatively kooky topic that is a thesis that has never been published. But as I was doing this, I had looked for primary traces of these utopian and underwater cities in archives in Paris, Zurich, and even Arizona. And this primary archival material was dispersed and pretty scant. So I thought it would be good to look closely, though quite unrelated to my thesis, at other archival material of the 60s. And the Ground Romberg Boyd Archive at the State Library of Victoria seemed like a really good place to do this. My initial idea was to focus on Boyd's civic works and speculative projects rather than the houses. This began a journey that was mainly pursued through a series of Sahans papers, Sahans being the Society of Architectural Historians of Australia and New Zealand. All these papers are acknowledged in the book, and in the papers we were able to see what emerged out of a deep trawl of the archive and then test various propositions about Boyd. The first paper, co-authored with Simon Wallen on Menzies, was published in 2003. So the book is very much a result of this very long process. The book asserts that Boyd's 1965 book, The Puzzle of Architecture, was his own project of revising modernism. During the 60s, many architects sought to do this. It was a project that he designated the third phase. This, for him, was an effort to focus on spatial design in architecture and to recapture the third dimension of space in modernism. As we note in our book, no less a figure than the American architect Phillips Johnson said the puzzle was a book every architect should have, although Johnson, in his usual ironic and cynical fashion, said it's better just to read pages 142 to 165 or something like that. Our book, of course, also places Boyd's work in context with his last book, the seemingly odd and disturbing The Great Australian Dream, which in many ways is a cipher of Boyd's own personal struggles with Australian culture at the end of the 60s. I wonder what Boyd would have thought of all this, of strangers from the suburbs that he seemed to so loathe sometimes, picking over every aspect of his work. I guess, and I hope, he would have appreciated the fact that the book helps to dispel the mythologies and historical profiling that has grown around him. I guess he might have liked the fact that our book positions him into a network of collaborators. Archives this large do not come about by the hand of one person. And sometimes I dream I'm in those lost worlds of the archive. The lost world of Expo 67, for example, inhabited by the other people that he worked with, including the poet Kenneth Slessor and the rogue hack George Farwell, and of course Sir Velston Hancock, who had flown Bristol Beauforts in the WEWAC campaign, a lost world of Australian Anglophone supremacy. But more vividly, I dream of the lost world of Boyd's own office. And these people, to me, from the archives, seem to be people that I know intimately by their first names: Berenice, Frederick, Carl, Bill Williams, Couchy, young Norman, and their clients, the Shelmerdines, the summer student Peter Wilson, as well as the seemingly peripheral Helen Tippett, who was to become the first female professor of architecture in Australasia. A lost world of architectural hopes that I think says much about architects today. Finally, I hope the book will make people think about the value of archival architectural scholarships and the importance of reimagining these lost worlds of social, cultural and architectural history. I'd like to thank my co-author, the esteemed Christine Phillips, Vivian Mezzigiani and Martin Hook at RMIT, who pretty much funded the book, Matt Ward at Euro, Stuart Geddes, our great graphic designer, and of course Norman, who so generously provided us with information and advice, and who we were able to interview at the end of the book. So thank you so much. That's it. I don't know.
Can we also add to that, thank you, the State Library
Yes.
Archives and also the RMIT Design Archives. And of course, Peter and I spent a lot of time going through dusty boxes and finding all sorts of hidden treasures, and we couldn't have done that without the support of the State Library and the RMIT Design Archives.
Particularly Lois McAvoy. And
Lois.
all the acknowledgements are in the back.
I'll talk. I remember going through that archives and thinking, well, you know, this is like going back to the office, because when we were in the office, we had it was all typed. We had a white copy which went to the client, and that had about 3 iterations because Boyd couldn't spell. We then had a pink copy which went in the file, and we had a yellow copy. No, yellow copy went in the file. Pink copy went up to Frederick Romberg in Newcastle, so we could check what we were doing, what libel we were heading towards. And so there exists a couple of copies of everything that was written. I keep remembering that because there's some letters missing. But it's funny when you go back and you read your old letters and things and you think, gee, I wasn't so bad. Shocking wording, but I do remember working on that building of yours, the building Menzies College out at La Trobe, and I was there building it before you got there, which is why you're one of my students. And I'm happy to say I passed Peter. But I remember going there and we were doing
Only just,
yeah,
if I recall.
Scraped through by the skin of my nose. But I remember going there at one stage. I went into Boyd's office. It was a very small office. There were only 5 of us there. And it was more than collegiate. It was like the boss was Dad and Mum and everything else, and there was the rest of us. Anyway, I went in there and I was doing a sketch for part of Menzies. Menzies had a lot of opposition from the students who hated raw concrete. They were very triple-fronted brick people. And I went in there and I had to do a sketch, and he said, you've got to show some greenery on the ground that will climb up the building. So I did, and I drew these little leaves. He showed me with the leaf he wanted. He was very meticulous. But he could draw, I couldn't. Leaves, I mean, really. Anyway, I went into his office and I said, there you go, there's the cotton Easter, and he just looked at me very patiently. He said, Catoni Easter, Norman, Catoni Easter. All right. And I remember a meeting we had shortly thereafter. We went there and the students were right up in arms. There was terrible trouble. And Boyd was not a patient man in meetings with bureaucrats, very impatient, kept looking at his watch. But they had trouble. The ground floor, it went up 4 stories, and the ground floor, there were meant to be little soffits of concrete in between each floor to sort of cut the noise back, but they'd cut that out for costing reasons. And so the ground floor, if there was something going on, And usually in the 60s and 70s, there was quite a lot going on in students' digs. Quite noisy. No one seemed to have any mufflers on. And so the noise would travel up the 4 stories. So if anyone was, let's say, banging away on the ground floor, the whole place knew about it. And I thought it was pretty exciting. Boyd didn't mind, but the students, they were uncomfortable. So we had a lot of exercise of fun with each other. But I do remember at that meeting that he had a very bossy head of Menzies who was from Adelaide. He was one of the Holden family people. Complete. And on his way out, Boyd always had great big American cars. He had a big white Dodge. And I think it's because his dad had been killed in a car crash. Anyway, he squirted the accelerator on this pebble car park, and he went out like a complete hood. I said to him, "What are you doing? We're going to crash into the trees." He said, "I don't like that, man." Took off. It was like being with a surfing guy, a friend in the 60s. So he was a very friendly guy to be with. It was funny, you sort of think Boyd now has become this iconic thing, but he wasn't. He was just a really gentle, very sensitive human being. And I don't think there's much difference between the importance of his writing or his buildings. I think they're just one life. But he was great fun to be with. And then I had the balance of being with Romberg, who was a different character altogether. So does anyone have any questions? I mean, that's, I suppose, the best way of bringing stuff out.
Well, I was hoping you'd tell us about I've spoken to you about this, but I thought you might share your experience of working on the Fishbowl restaurant and the site visit and the struggles of that.
It wasn't a struggle. I was 24. I thought it was easy. If I'd done that now, I'd be in jail. Boyd was extremely generous. He trusted me. I was not a graduate to do this single fishbowl building. So the way Boyd worked was he had his little left-hand sketches, like an ant had walked over the page, very lightweight writing, tiny, spelling errors. And he'd draw a sketch, and then he'd give it to you, one of us in the office. He'd say, "That's your project." So we took it from that little hand-drawn sketch, which is in the file at the library and in the book, and then we would develop it up through sketch panes. We'd deal with the clients, Richard Frank, Lillian Frank's husband, restaurateur, and Peter Shelmerdine, developer. I mean, they were tough dudes. And Boyd got on with them famously. Anyway, it was my job as an undergraduate. I don't think we told him I was an undergraduate. But we then developed it up, did the sketches. There were going to be these things all over Melbourne. But we were going to build the first one freestanding in South Yarra. And that was my job then, to document it, get the engineers organised, sublet the building or contract it out to a builder, and administer the contract. And of course, Boyd was not good at administration of contracts. But I was still studying at Melbourne Uni, professional practice. So I just got my file out from the university and copied it to admin the building. It was good. I got good letters back, complimentary. Because no one else had done anything like that in the office before. They were all looking at it thinking, what's Norman doing with this? But anyway, it was good fun. But I do remember at one stage, so there was the circular building with the ball on top. And that's quite a challenge. But when you're 24, you think, yeah, it's pretty ordinary. The courage he had to give it to someone like me, who had never done a freestanding building, and say, you build it, off you go. It's incredible, isn't it? There couldn't have been litigation. Just couldn't have been. Anyway, I do remember one letter, which I can't find in the file at the library, is that he wrote a letter to the 2 clients saying, I'm not quite sure that it's going to be a ball on top. Norman's having a bit of trouble working out how to make a ball that big. And a bit of trouble is an understatement. So, but he had no idea either. So I do remember this, and I remember thinking, bugger you, I'm going to make that a ball. And so I went up to see my professor of construction at Melbourne Uni. I used my Melbourne Uni contacts a lot, and he didn't have a clue, but he said, go and see this professor at engineering. He'll probably know how to do it. And I went to see him, and he was a complete nerd. He had 3 or 4 pullovers on and smelt a bit. And But he had a solution. He said, yeah, we can do that. It's a snub-nosed dodecahedron. I said, oh, yeah, well, I knew that, but, you know. How do we build it? And he said, oh, well, it's sort of like this. It's all. We didn't want a frame. We just wanted a self-contained ball. Boyd later said, he later wrote after it was finished, it was designed like a ball, those glass balls that hang in fish shops with the net cage holding them up to the ceiling. That was absolute bullshit. He never thought of that at the time. Anyway, we designed this thing and then we had to build it, and we got some German guys from the hills with a great big Alsatian, 36 bottles of beer every time they came to site, and eventually they sort of pieced it together. But at one stage they'd got it so a third of it was on the top of the building and the other 2/3 was on the bottom, all pre-assembled. And the idea was on a Sunday morning to lift it up and drop it on and connect it all. So I phoned Boyd, he was in Wall Street, and I said, come on round, it's all happening, it's pretty exciting, Mr. Boyd. We were very polite. And he came round and the guys lifted it up and it was pretty exciting. There were people all over the place and they dropped it down very, very slowly and it didn't fit by a mile. It was about a metre out. And Boyd just looked at me, very patient man. He said, I think I'll go home now. So he went home and I stayed with the guys and they worked out that it had sort of egg-shaped itself because it wasn't all connected. So they put spacing bars and all sorts of, they're very German, you know. And they got it all to work and they locked it in. He came round again at 4 o'clock and I said, it's look. He said, yeah, it's good, fine, well done, bye. That's will you ever get out of Boyd. But it was very exciting, you know, for someone like me. And of course, within a year and a half, he was dead and the fishbowl was gone. So great patience people had with that building. But he was extremely courageous. I think much more courageous than people expected, of a gentle man. If you listen to his voice now on tapes and things, the boy lectures, for example, he sounds very proper and slightly British, but he wasn't. He had a nasty, funny sense of humour, a cutting sense of humour. He was not nasty, but a cutting sense of humour, and it didn't like fools much. He had an incredible passion for Australia and everything Australian. That's why he could have gone to the States a long time earlier. There was a career waiting for him, not just with Philip Johnson. It would have been useless. But he could have gone to Harvard or Yale or somewhere. But he loved Australia. He loved the smell of the trees and the bush. And the Boyd family was, of course, linked to Australia. He loved drawing gum trees, and it was in his DNA, I think. He used to drive me home from work pretty well every night in his great big Dodge. He'd come down, we were in East Melbourne, we'd come down Punt Road, and then he'd turn around. At that stage you could turn around to go towards the city and then drive along the Yarra. He lived in Wall Street, I was in St Leonard's Court, just nearby. And I used to say to him, why do you do that? Just out of interest. He said, look at the trees. He just wanted to see the trees every night on his way home. That's how the way he was. So, good man, yeah, wonderful man. Very comfortable to work with him. But it does seem a while ago.
It's amazing how much you remember. And we do have an interview with Norman in the book. And it was great having those conversations with you along the way as we were writing. Because Peter and I would have lots of conversations and we'd just always cross-checking with you, Norman, so that was wonderful.
Yeah, it was good. And there were times, because one of the aspects of the research that we did for the book was looking through all the financial records, the weekly payroll, and through that we could tell who was working at the office during any particular period of time. I think they were actually fortnightly. And then there were all the expenses. And then I remember ringing up Norman, like, this is like deep archival research. Only dimly, like I said, Norman, why was Carl always taking out this money every week to go to this place? Or what I think it was some sort of embassy or something. Anyway, so the granularity of what we were looking at was really quite detailed and in some parts interesting. So
Carl Fender was very like that. I mean, he still is. He just goes into places and pinches money off them. Shocking. No, I don't know what he was doing. It was probably petty cash, was it?
Yeah, it was petty cash.
Yeah, I was paid $38 a week. I thought I was on a real roll. When Boyd died, we had no money. We were totally broke. He hadn't sent any bills out. It's funny that. And Romberg came down, and Romberg was not like that. And so everyone left the office. I was the one who kept looking at Romberg. I didn't realise all my friends had just left the office. I mean, there were only 5 of them. But he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'll stay." And he said, "Well, there's no money." I said, "Oh, yeah, that's a problem." Well, but I did. I thought I would give it a shot. I had one little project of my own. And I lasted a year and a half, and then Romberg very kindly, I actually went out and collected money. I was so bitter, I suppose. I was sad to have lost Boyd. I thought all these people owed money to him and his estate. And so I collected all this money from people who, I just remember going to meetings with people who were sweating profusely out of fear. And it was just little me, 24-year-old, still at uni. "Give me your money. Or I'll tell the press." That's sort of roughly the way I went. And we collected thousands. Well, I did. But then Romberg made me a director of the company, which I thought was terrific. You know, Romberg and Boyd. I didn't get my name on the firm, but on the bottom of the letterhead, Norman Day Director. Still not a graduate. And I remember thinking, that's pretty good. I spoke to him about it later. I got on very well with Romberg. And he said, "Well, yes, you've earned it, Norman. You've done really well for us. Thank you. And do you realise that directors aren't paid a salary? You get a cut of any profit, you know." I loved Romberg with a passion. He was a wonderful man. Very similar characters in a way. It's funny, they don't appear to be, but they are both incredibly generously human being people. I was reminded of a story, Pete, when you were just saying that before. Boyd was strangely conservative. He appeared to be of the conservative mould in Australia, the Boyd family, but, you know, artist family. And he wasn't at all. He was as left as one of our closest friends, Jean McLean. He was Jean McLean in a suit. And I remember when the moratorium was on, he encouraged, he said, "Are you guys all leaving the office today? You know, the march is on." And I remember my friends saying, "No, I'm not." And I said, "Yeah, I'm going." And he said, good, off you go. But he was telling me a story once. We were driving down to some project, and he'd always drive. I'd always drive and he'd read. That's the way he went, because he all right in the car. But we'd chat, and he was saying about a meeting he'd been to. He'd been collected by a whole lot of architects and friends of the Liberal Party to go to a fundraiser at the Melbourne Club for Rupert Hamer to run the Liberal Party, whatever it was, election thing. And he got there, and the deal was it was an auction. So you went in there, and the one who made the first bid, $1,000, good. The next one had to make a double bid, $2,000 or whatever, $3,000. Hi, Rob. And so he of course, he had no money. He couldn't even offer. He didn't have a bank card. And so he went into the toilets at the Melbourne Club, and he sat there for 3 hours until the meeting had dispersed. He couldn't afford $1. And I said, that's quite courageous. And he said, "Yeah, well, I wouldn't have given it to the Liberal Party anyway." So very interesting, you know, I mean,
I think
this
that
famous architect.
it comes out in his
hiding in the
architecture,
toilet.
though, don't you think,
Yeah,
Norman?
yeah.
There's a sort of care for the public and the civic, and
He was very
probably
conscious of people
he was.
and not organisations.
Yeah,
He was not that interested in bureaucrats
yeah.
or anything like that. That wasn't part of his world. So there was an artistic characteristic to him, which obviously he'd inherited. You're not a Boyd accidentally, are you? So, but it was always interesting that it came out very subtly. There'd just be this little story about hiding in the toilets at the Melbourne Club, and you think, that's my boss. And things like that. It was, you know, it's quite proactive in a way. Strange. So not the gentleman that people think. He wasn't that at all. He was quite oppositional. I once asked him, he'd been in the Air Force in New Guinea, and so it always appeared to me he's not army quality person. If he was going to be in the army, the Air Force or something, he'd be Spike Milligan, shooting himself. But he'd gone there and then he got involved in making bridges, and he really enjoyed it. But all of it was trying to learn more about architecture. So he brought that Bailey Bridge idea back, and then that came the bridge house in Toorak and other attitudes that he brought to his architecture. Everything was a learning curve. And the other thing with Boyd is that if you went to I used to go to the office off on a Sunday morning to catch up. I was a very slow learner, still am. But Boyd would always be there with his little dog, and sometimes Susie, youngest daughter, writing. And so it was a great advantage from my point of view to have 2 or 3 hours to talk to the boss. He'd keep writing while you chat. He was one of those men who could do everything at once. There's only one man I've ever met who could do it. So just lucky. But my son was asking me the other day, how did I get the job there? Because it was pretty unusual. And I'd been out, I'd failed third year at Melbourne Uni. I'd failed all the structures and all that stuff. I'd done very well at design and history and life class, because I loved life class with a passion. And so I had to repeat it. So I had 2 days, I had university and 3 days off. So I made a list of what I'd do, work with architects. Then I had made another list, Romberg and Boyd. So one day I'd been to the beach and I was still in my beach gear, with sand all over places. And I knocked on the door in East Melbourne. I just went up there to have a look at it, and I thought, well, I was a bit of it sounds sick, doesn't it? But I knocked on the door, and he answered it, because it was a Sunday morning. I didn't know he'd be there. And he said, oh, who are you? And I said, well, I'm just explained what I was. And he said, oh, no, well, we don't have any work here. We're a very small office. What have you been doing? And I said, well, I've just been 3 months in Japan on a student trip. He said, oh, that's a bit different. Come on in. We've just started Expo 70. It's obviously in Osaka. Start Monday. I got a job. I couldn't believe it. That was the interview. Then I went home and got dressed for Monday. Stayed there forever. So, yeah, it's one of those sort of, serendipity. But there were just... To give you an idea of the gentleness, I think a lot of people... You lose the humanity in history, I think. And we were doing a house for Shelmerdine, the older Shelmerdine, whose wife was Marigold Meyer, who was Marigold Shelmerdine, the governor. She took over as being governor of Victoria a while back. We're doing a house for them, and it was a renovation for the daughter. And she was a really nice kid, and she was on the first floor of their house in Toorak. And my job, because I was the do-it-all little dude, was to do the job and provide this really nice joinery. Boyd sketched out what he wanted, and then it was my job to do everything. But I used to go there every second day or third day to check. It was quite a fast build. And I'd knock on the door, they'd help me up, and the builder was doing away. And I remember at one stage Boyd said, oh, I'll meet you there this morning. I'll come about an hour later. You do your site meeting, then I'll come along and have a look. And I said to the guys in the meeting, well, he said he'd be here. And all of a sudden there's this clatter on the balcony out the front of the building, which is where the bedroom, it's a bedroom renovation, fronted. And here's the boss coming up the ladder. In other words, he thought he'd go tradesman's entrance. He wouldn't have the gall to knock on the front door and be invited in. And so he climbed this ladder. I don't know, I just thought we'd lose him. It wasn't tied up or anything. But that was Boyd. Another time he went to Melbourne City Council, and he was talking about a permit for one of the projects for the units that's in the book, Carnick apartment block. And he went there and he made a time to see the town planner, and he came back and he said, do you know, Norman, the town planner saw me personally. And I said, well, how about that? He wanted to see Robin Boyd personally. Gee, well. So imagine that. He didn't quite understand. We all knew, but he didn't seem to care. It was waddle on. So he was a very unassuming, gentle, but that brain was just non-stop ticking. I mean, people, I know there are a lot of furious workers in the world, but he was potentially the most furious I've ever seen. There were just packets of his brain all the time at work. And so at 52, you die, I suppose. You just run out of energy, which he did.